So, welcome to the third part of my series of videos in which I explore the question of whether or not God could be said to matter. And in this episode, I'll be discussing why and how God could be said to matter with regard to the fairly broad topic of truth. So, when we examine the relationship between God and what we might call big T truth, there are a number of different ways that a theist might approach this issue and attempt to show why God is important in relation to truth, but a lot of my responses to these sorts of arguments are going to be pretty similar, so we're not going to run through absolutely every single argument that could possibly be raised to justify why God is important, why he matters to the topic of truth, because many of the arguments that I could raise against any one of these in particular is also going to apply to some extent to the others as well. So, to be clear, we are not going to be attempting to show why these theories are false. In fact, we're going to extend a principle of charity here and assume that there is some truth to each of these arguments, but what we're going to try to explore are the consequences of these arguments. So if we accept them as true, if they really are successful, then we ask the question, what is changed? What do we gain, in some sense, from accepting these theories as true? How would the world be different given the truth of these arguments compared to their falsity, and so on. So I'm not here to try to show you why arguments for God's existence in relation to truth are false. Rather, I'm here to show you why they don't matter, and why, therefore, the existence of God doesn't really matter in the context of truth. Now, you might expect me at this point to attempt to define what truth is, and no, I'm definitely not going to do that. That is not a minefield I want to step onto, and it's for two pretty clear reasons. The first is that there really isn't a definitive answer to that question. Philosophers have been asking what is truth for thousands of years. I don't think they've made a hell of a lot of progress on that score, and certainly I don't believe that I'm going to solve the problem in a podcast episode of an hour or two. But I also don't think we really need a rigorous definition of truth here, because we're looking at theories that maybe have different ideas about what truth involves, but they all seem pretty clear about what truth is, so we don't need to adopt some external standard of what truth might or might not be. Rather, we'll look at the theories and the kinds of definitions of truth that they propose, or what they see as central features of something that is true, and judging them on their own merits. So we are not going to decide, I'm sad to say, what really is or is not true about the nature of reality in this episode, or attempting to define what truth might be. Rather, we're just going to look at certain arguments about the relationship between God and truth, and asking ourselves, if these arguments are true, if they are valid, then what does it actually matter? What have we gained from the realization of this sort of truth? So the first and probably most common sort of argument that we encounter with respect to why God might matter to the making of truth is something like positing God as the sort of foundation of truth. So here we could posit God as, the sort of metaphysical reality which undergirds everything, and by virtue of that, he is also going to be the source of truth. There are similar arguments which say something like, everything that is true is somehow vouchsafed in the mind of God, so a lot of what we might call truths are sort of abstract things, let's say mathematical truths or moral truths, and so therefore God is the only kind of being who could possibly vouchsafe these truths. It's only in the mind of God that these sorts of abstract truths could be said to exist. And then there are arguments which say that God is basically conspecific with everything. God is reality itself, so therefore God is big T truth. And then there are similar arguments which say something like certain particular truths, big T truths, are eternal, so it is an eternal truth that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So as a way to vouchsafe these truths, we do need to posit a level of reality that is eternal and unchanging, and God would be a suitable candidate for that. So these are all slightly different kinds of arguments, but what they all share in common is this idea that, one, God is the sort of metaphysical ground of all being, and therefore he is some way going to be the ground of all truths. And two, therefore, that the existence of God really matters, because if there were no God, then presumably there would not exist this stable foundation for truth in general, and therefore we could say that big T truth, in the absence of God, would be impossible. So, therefore, the arguments might run, we can be very thankful that God exists, because it means we really can make the assumption that big T truth exists, and hey, that's a good thing. So here, of course, the atheist could simply shrug her shoulders and say, well, I agree with you, maybe God is necessary for big T truth, but in that case, so much for big T truth. There is no God, therefore there cannot be any sort of ultimate truth. Too bad, that's the world we live in. And I think that's absolutely a valid argument. It's not particularly interesting, it doesn't really engage with the material, so I think we can do a bit better than that. But just to be clear, an atheist doesn't actually have to disagree with any of these arguments. An atheist can absolutely say, yes, God or something like God would be necessary in order to vouchsafe the existence of big T truth, but therefore there is no big T truth because there is no God. That's a perfectly valid argument. But we'll extend a principle of charity here and assume, one, there is a God, and two, that this God would be a suitable grounding for the existence of some ultimate truths, some unchanging and unvarying truths. But we will then ask ourselves, okay, having accepted this, what is changed? What have we gained from this? What difference does this make in concrete terms to our understanding of the world? And the first reason why I would say it doesn't make any difference to our understanding of the world is that merely positing the existence of big T truth doesn't give us any sort of insight into what that big T truth is. So it might be nice, perhaps, to think, oh, well, there is an ultimate reality, there is something that is ultimately true. Not everything that we experience is just a veil or an illusion. There is something substantive and dependable there at the heart of all existence. But is that really any consolation if we are unable to understand what that truth is? So this is particularly going to be a problem in those theistic religious traditions which posit a God who is fundamentally other and fundamentally unknowable. We can identify that God with big T truth, great, but what have we actually learned from that? We haven't learned anything deep about the fundamental nature of this ultimate reality. All we've said is that there must be an ultimate reality, but what are we to do with this knowledge? How is this knowledge going to improve our lives? What are we to do next? What are our existential options? The mere knowledge that there is a big T truth, an ultimate truth, is not going to answer any of these questions for us. Now, it is of course true that many theists will assert that actually some aspect of this ultimate truth can be revealed to human beings, that is, that God does in some sense reveal himself in the world, and this would be a more sort of concrete type of knowledge. We will address this in a moment. But for now, if we assume that God is basically fundamentally unknowable, that we can't really access the mind of God with any sort of reliability or ease, we can imagine a theist and a nihilist looking out a window at the same landscape. The theist sees that landscape and imagines that it is undergirded by this ultimate truth, by divine truth, whereas the nihilist looks out at the same landscape and says that there is no ultimate truth at all. What is it that the theist has in this situation? What can he see? What can he understand about what he is seeing that is simply unavailable to the nihilist? To me, it seems apparent that whatever sort of metaphysical gloss you put on reality, whether you want to say that reality is undergirded by certain kinds of truths or not, I think we're basically looking at the same landscape. We are living in the same world, we are living under the same set of circumstances. Existentially, nothing really changes for you just by recognizing that the world might be undergirded by some kind of ultimate truth. But there's another sort of more philosophical sense in which it might be said that God doesn't really matter vis-a-vis the existence of ultimate truth, and that is what might be termed the problem of the existence of abstract objects. So there is a long-standing philosophical debate, and like many philosophical debates, this one strikes me as kind of tedious and useless, but it's a debate concerning the sort of ontological status of abstract objects. So an abstract object might be something, for example, like numbers. So you can't just go out into the world and point at number 7, you can't pick up the number 7 and hold it in your hands, but yet the number 7 and all other numbers, all other sorts of mathematics, appear to have a kind of ontological validity in the world. There really does seem to be a particular sense in which events in the world are governed by kind of mathematical laws, which appear to have a kind of ontological vehemence that is otherwise pretty difficult to explain. But if we really accept the existence of abstract objects, so we say something like numbers, that mathematics, that these really do have a kind of ontological validity, we run into the problem that they appear to share many of the same properties that we typically attribute to God. So these sorts of truths, the truth that 2 plus 2 equals 4, appears to be eternally valid. There does not appear to be any possible world or any possible state of affairs in which that mathematical equation fails to obtain as true. And it's by virtue of this that we could also suggest that these abstract objects must in some sense be uncreated because they are going to obtain in every possible reality. And they also appear to serve as a kind of grounding for other sorts of truths. So the fact that I can take 2 oranges and add another 2 oranges to them in order to get 4 oranges, this appears to be following this deeper law, or it appears to be grounded in this deeper law of arithmetic that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So if it is the case that abstract objects really do exist, that they really do have this kind of ontological validity, then it appears they also have to have these properties of being eternal, of being uncreated, and of grounding other facts about reality. So the theological problem here, I think, is pretty clear that these are 3 properties we would typically ascribe to God and assert as one of the reasons why God is necessary for the existence of ultimate truths. But the fact is that if these abstract objects really do exist, then they appear to exist independently of God. They appear to be eternal, uncreated, and to serve a kind of grounding function independently of anything God thinks or anything God does. And, of course, in the first place, that would serve to undermine the necessity of God as the kind of vouchsafe of ultimate truth, because it appears that these ultimate truths would exist whether or not God exists. They were not created by God because they were uncreated. They are co-eternal with God. So therefore, there do appear to be certain kinds of truths on this sort of theory that exist independently of God. So the first theological problem with abstract objects is that they, I would say, lessen the importance of God with respect to the securing of ultimate truths, because, as we've said, these are ultimate truths that appear to exist independently of God. And secondly, it creates potentially a more distressing problem in theology that God really isn't the master of the universe, that there are certain things that he is restricted from doing by virtue of the existence of these abstract objects. So he could not will it, for example, that 2 plus 2 equals 5. He could not will it that both P and not P could be true at the same time, so he doesn't have any control over logic. He is subject, in fact, to the laws of logic. And in all these sorts of cases, it's obviously a pretty big restriction on what God can do. It is a limit on his power. It is a limit on his will. And in that kind of scenario, we have to ask, who actually is God in this situation? If the laws of mathematics, the laws of logic dictate, in fact, what it is that God is able to do in the world, then isn't it in some way the case that these abstract objects, these laws of mathematics and logic, are in fact God, because it appears to be God who is constrained by these laws rather than the other way around? Now, there are, of course, ways for theists to sidestep this issue, so the easiest way available to them, I think, would simply be to deny the ontological validity of abstract objects and to say that, in fact, mathematical laws like 2 plus 2 equals 4 are not really eternal truths. They were maybe, I don't know, contingently created by God, or they somehow otherwise don't have this independent ontological validity. And strangely enough, I don't think I've ever actually heard a theist make this argument. As I said in one of the very first episodes on this channel, one of the characteristic features of religious thought is this tendency towards reification, this tendency towards believing that abstract things are somehow independently real and they have this real magical causal efficacy. So, I mean, that's an option available to them. The theist could simply deny that abstract objects exist, that they really don't have ontological validity in the sense I've talked about. But, you know, as I said, in practice, they don't do this. The other option available would be to try a kind of linguistic trick and to say, well, actually, the laws of mathematics, the laws of logic, and so on are not really independent of God. They are somehow part of the very nature of God. And, you know, in fact, there is nothing outside of God. So therefore, anything that exists, including mathematical laws, including logical laws, have to be part of God's being. And in some ways that appears to do away with the problem, because we no longer have this issue of independently existing abstract objects, but it doesn't do away with this problem that God does not appear to have any control over their nature. So even if we say that mathematical laws are really somehow a part of God, we're still left with the problem that they exist, it appears, independently of divine will. So it doesn't really matter whether these laws are internal to God or external to God. What matters is that they appear to have a kind of control over God's nature that God does not possess over them. So the laws of logic dictate, for example, that God is a necessary being, that God therefore cannot kill himself, so God is beholden to this particular law of necessary being, but it's not reciprocal. God cannot change those laws. God is beholden to them. And as I've said, whether or not those laws could be considered to be internal or external to God, what matters is that they appear to exist independently of divine will. And so therefore, what God thinks, what God does, is absolutely immaterial when it comes to what is fundamentally true. But however the theist reacts to such arguments, what it does point to is that there is at least a path available to someone who wishes to preserve the existence of ultimate, unchanging, very reliable truths without needing to posit the existence of God. So God is not necessary for the grounding of ultimate truth. So it would be perfectly coherent for an atheist to say that, yeah, ultimate truth exists. The laws of arithmetic are ultimate truths. The laws of logic are ultimate truths. And they could even, go one step further. They could confabulate this realm of perfect Platonic ideas where every single truth in existence is somehow vouchsafed in this Platonic heaven that exists in a perfect form somewhere and somehow. And I'm not saying that I believe that's a particularly good step for an atheist to take. I think that Platonism has its own set of problems, but the point is that there are philosophical ideas available to someone who wishes to preserve the existence of an ultimate truth while at the same time rejecting the existence of God. So another way to put that is that the existence of God is in no way necessary for the securing of the existence of an ultimate truth. But as we've said, there is a different class of arguments which would say that God is somehow integral with respect to the issue of truth, not simply because of these sort of metaphysical concerns that God metaphysically grounds ultimate truth, but rather because God is a reliable source of truth. So God is, of course, imagined as someone omniscient who can know everything, but there are some theists who will maintain that God, at least occasionally, periodically, intervenes in the world to make this truth known. So God is not simply important because he grounds truth, but because he exists as a kind of being who is able to reveal otherwise deep and inaccessible truths by virtue of some sort of special revelation. And there are some traditions which are comfortable with the idea that God is sort of constantly revealing himself to people and revealing new truths to them. So particularly in Christianity and some forms of Hinduism, they are very comfortable with this idea that God is constantly intervening in the minds of people, I guess, and delivering certain truths to them, giving them certain messages, nudging them to behave in certain ways. So you could have it that, yeah, God is there. He is revealing very important bits of preternatural knowledge to people with great regularity, and Christians and Hindus, as I've said, would be pretty comfortable with that idea. I think for Jews and for Muslims, this idea is a little bit less comfortable. God in these traditions is a little bit more distant, perhaps, but they, of course, still make room for the historical reality of divine revelations. So in the case of Judaism, of course, you have the revelation of the commandments to Moses. You have God speaking to various prophets throughout history and delivering important messages to his people. So in Judaism, I think it's pretty much accepted that the prophetic age is at a close. Anyone who turns up in a temple today claiming to be a prophet of Yahweh is not going to have a very easy time, I don't think. And in the case of Islam, of course, there was the special revelation of the Quran and the various divine inspirations that were granted to the Prophet Muhammad that have been recorded in the Hadith. So again, it's sort of expected that Muhammad had this special relationship with Allah, and that through this special relationship, we have the revelation of the Quran, which supposedly reveals certain timeless, otherwise inaccessible truths, and also because during his entire prophetic career, Muhammad was apparently in pretty close contact with Allah and was able to give the earliest community of Muslims some very important ethical advice that, originates from his charismatic relationship with Allah and this has been preserved in the Hadith. So in Judaism and Islam, there is this idea that God does reveal himself, that he delivers some very important truths, particularly of an ethical nature, but that this sort of period of communication with human beings is more or less closed. These are historical revelations rather than the kinds of ongoing revelations that you might find in Christianity and some types of Hinduism. So, of course, the first and most obvious question is how it is we can know that these revelations are actually veridical, how it is we can trust people who claim to be speaking to God. So that would be a sort of separate issue. We're going to proceed with a principle of charity, as is the theme in these episodes, and assume that these divine revelations really do happen, so that, for example, the prophets of Judaism really were speaking to God, that the Quran really is a revelation from God, that Christians today really are being spoken to by God through the power of the Holy Spirit, and so on. And we will ask ourselves, okay, given that all of this divine revelation is going on, given that God is apparently happy to divulge these secrets about the nature of reality to human beings, how concretely does that benefit us? How is it that all of these divine revelations could be said to matter? So I'll preface this with the disclaimer that it's going to be a little bit difficult to discuss this issue without getting a little bit snarky, because some of the arguments presented really are not very good. So when we talk about God being important with respect to truth because he is a being with the unique power to reveal very special and important truths to human beings that would otherwise remain hidden, the main problem here is that he doesn't seem to reveal anything particularly important, particularly interesting, particularly surprising, with any great sort of regularity. So if we think about the kind of knowledge that might really be important to human beings, that might really be of value to us, how many divine revelations actually address these issues? So God is revealing important truths about the nature of the universe. So does he tell us when the next earthquake is going to happen? No, he doesn't do that. Does he reveal to us how we can reconcile the laws of quantum mechanics with the laws of gravity? No, strangely, he's not very interested in doing that. Well, so what exactly is he interested in revealing to us? Well, he tends to be interested in revealing, let's say, very obvious ethical laws. He will tell us, hey, don't murder people, don't steal things, be nice to your mother and father. But when it comes to really thorny moral issues, these kinds of moral issues where maybe we would really need divine guidance, he seems to be pretty silent. So there are any number of hot button ethical issues, so capital punishment, euthanasia, you name it. There are all kinds of genuine moral disagreements that exist in societies, and importantly, even within religious communities. So there are Christians, for example, who are very divided on the question of something like, say, the moral propriety of capital punishment. Why isn't God making definitive revelations on this issue? It's fine to say, don't murder someone, but something more helpful would be a definitive clarification on what counts as murder and what does not. Or in the case of the revelation of, let's say, more scientific truths, and if someone asked me what it would take for me to abandon atheism and to start believing in God, my answer has always been pretty simple, and that would be the reliable revelation of testable preternatural knowledge. So what that means is that if God can reveal something to human beings that they could not possibly have known otherwise, about the nature of reality, and that this is something they could test for themselves. So, for example, as I said, God delivers us a way to reconcile quantum mechanics with gravity. Some completely unschooled person just wakes up one morning with a perfect solution to this problem, or, if I wake up tomorrow morning with a perfect working knowledge of Aramaic grammar, in a way, this wouldn't definitively prove that God exists. Maybe it's aliens who would be revealing this information to us, or, maybe my wife would be piping in learn Aramaic in 30 days CDs while I'm sleeping, something like that. But to me, that would be enough to definitively accept that a God exists, because I can't think of any other credible way that that knowledge could be conveyed to human beings other than through a God. So this is something potentially very important. God certainly could, if he wished, reveal very important truths about the nature of the universe that we could test scientifically, that would somehow precede our own scientific knowledge. But God literally never does this. And I follow Islamic apologetics. There's a series of YouTube channels referred to as Dawa YouTube, and this seems to be a very common argument that these YouTubers, at least, use in defense of the divine origin of the Quran, and that is that the Quran contains certain scientific knowledge that could not possibly have been known to ordinary human beings living in 7th century Arabia. So therefore, if the Quran contains these scientific truths that could not have been learnt by human beings living at that time, then this must be a sign of their divine origin. Now, the concrete examples that they use in support of this claim sort of vary between being comical and just being outright pathetic. So, a couple of these that stick in my mind for some reason. The first is this Quranic passage which suggests that Allah created human beings from a clot of blood. And so Islamic apologists will use this to say that actually the Quran anticipated the science of embryology, because there was no way that people living in 7th century Arabia could have known this fact about human beings. Now, it shouldn't escape your notice that this actually is not a very good description of what embryology is. It is, I would say, fundamentally incorrect to say that a human being in the mother's womb develops from a blood clot. That's really not what is happening. But even if we extend a principle of charity and say that, blood clot is somehow a metaphor for the ova or something like this, we're still left with the problem that not a single Muslim theologian was able to anticipate any of the concrete findings of embryology that we have developed, in the last 100 years. So you can certainly try to argue that the Quran anticipated the science of embryology, but it doesn't change the fact that this knowledge was perfectly useless to Muslim societies for 1300 years until the science of embryology actually was developed, independently, by the way, of any knowledge of the Quran. Or then you get claims like it's something about how important water is to life, and of course, now science can prove that that is true, that, yeah, living things do need water, but if you are someone who is living in a desert climate in 7th century Arabia, it is literally a matter of life and death to recognize that water is central to living things. And so the fact that the Quran points that out, that water is essential to life, is that really such a big revelation? Should we really be astonished by the revelation of this knowledge? Would there not be a chance that human beings might eventually have found out anyway that water is somehow important to life? So I really can't think of a single concrete example of God revealing a testable and useful scientific truth to human beings throughout history. And when we look at the kind of revelations that people continue to receive, let's say in Christian traditions, they really, again, are very, very vague in many cases. They really don't offer a lot of general help to humanity and the kinds of things that existentially concern us. So God will, of course, intervene if someone's having a hard time. They will speak to the person and say, "Don't worry, everything's going to be okay." That's fine, but it's hardly world-shattering information. Or God might intervene and tell a president like George W. Bush, "Hey, please go and invade Iraq. This is a divine commandment that you do this." And yeah, I mean, was that really helpful to the world? Is it good that God told George W. Bush to go and invade Iraq? I would say probably not. But again, the kinds of things that God is apparently revealing to people just are not the kinds of truths that are useful or helpful or in any way significant to people. So God can reveal all of these truths that he wants. He can speak to millions and millions of Christians and Hindus and people of other faiths every day, giving them these vague commandments, these vague injunctions to keep going, but it's of absolutely zero net benefit to humanity. We don't appear to be gaining anything tangible by God speaking to us so frequently. Okay, so I'll move on now from some of these more general considerations about the relationship between God and truth, and focus now on some sort of more specific philosophical arguments relating to the nature of truth and the nature of God. And the first one I'd like to look at is what we might call the problem of Ipseity. So Ipseity is one of these sort of scary-sounding philosophical words, but it's from the Latin ipse, which means self. So when we talk about Ipseity, we are talking about basically what it is like to be a particular self. And what we can particularly focus on here is the kind of subjective experiences that we each have, and more specifically, how these can relate to the issue of truth. So there have been a number of different philosophical arguments which have attempted to demonstrate that there is something significant about subjective experience, and that these sorts of subjective experiences, our sense of ipseity, has to count as a kind of knowledge. So perhaps the two most famous philosophical arguments relating to this issue are Thomas Nagel's essay, What It Is Like to Be a Bat, and Frank Jackson's famous Mary's Room experiment. So the first one, Nagel's What It Is Like to Be a Bat, argues that human beings can study bats, and we can learn how it is that they use echolocation to find their way around the world. So we can learn basically everything about a bat's behavior. But Nagel's argument would be that we still don't really know, and in principle we can never know, what it is actually like to be a bat. So we can know that a bat uses echolocation to find its way around a dark cave, but what we can never know is what it actually feels like. What does it feel like to think in terms of echolocation, to experience the world in this way? As creatures who don't really have this sense, or at least not to the same extent that bats have it, we will never really know what it feels like to be a bat. And importantly, for the context of this episode, it also means that there is some kind of truth, some kind of knowledge that will forever be inaccessible to us. We can study bats as much as we like. We are never going to learn the truth of what it feels like to be a bat. And the second of these thought experiments, the so-called Mary's Room experiment, asks us to imagine a very brilliant scientist who spends her entire life studying color, and she comes to learn basically every propositional truth that there is with respect to the color red. So she knows exactly what wavelengths red objects emit, She knows exactly how the human eye functions and exactly how the stimulation of certain parts of the retina are translated into knowledge of colors. So she knows absolutely everything there is to know about color, but for some reason she has lived her entire life in a black and white room. So she's never actually seen any of these colors for herself, even though she knows, in theory, everything there is to know about them. But one day, someone unlocks the door, they let her out of her black and white laboratory, and the first thing that she sees is a red rose. Now, what Jackson argues is that by seeing this color red for the first time, she is actually learning something new about the color red. So even though it would have been true to say that previously she had known every possible true proposition that exists with respect to the color red, that subjective experience of what it feels like to see red is still a new piece of knowledge to her. So, in this thought experiment, similar to the last one, what it tells us with respect to the topic of this episode is that there are certain things that we can call truths or, justified knowledge that relate to the feeling of subjective experience, to our experience of qualia, this sense of ipseity, what it feels like to be ourselves and to experience the world. These really are kinds of knowledge in themselves. They are kinds of truths. Now, interestingly, these were both arguments that were introduced to challenge the philosophy of physicalism with respect to the philosophy of mind. So, physicalism says that all conscious experience, that all minds are dependent on and indeed reducible to physical processes. So the physicalist is a kind of metaphysical monist who denies that there is any distinction to be made between mind and matter. So in contrast to substance dualists who would argue that the mind and body are two different things, the physicalist says that actually the mind is reducible to the body. There is no substantive distinction to be made there. And what Nagel and Jackson were attempting to show with these experiments is that there are aspects of truth, of knowledge, that are not reducible to physical processes, that there is a kind of subjectivity that all living organisms possess, and that this cannot really be accounted for on a purely physicalist approach to the mind. Now, there is absolutely no way known that we are going to go into depth about the philosophy of mind here, but what we'll focus on is the relevance to the topic, the relationship between God and truth. So, even though these arguments are presented as a repudiation of physicalism, and even though I think the theist outlook has to be also opposed to physicalism, I don't think it's possible to believe in God as a being who has a kind of mind, who has a kind of conscious experience, I suppose, and yet believe that consciousness is reducible to physical processes. I think theism, if you posit the existence of a disembodied mind, like God, depends on the truth of dualism. So you might expect that these sorts of thought experiments by Nagel and Jackson would be of assistance to the theistic position, but what I would say is that they present some genuine difficulties to the theistic position that other philosophers have also noted, and it relates to the fact that God is supposedly omniscient, of course, that he knows everything that there is to know, and normally that's explained as God knowing every possible true proposition. But if there is also this kind of truth that depends on subjective experience, so what it feels like to be a bat or what it feels like to see the color red, then what does that say for God's omniscience? Can God actually have these sorts of experiences? Can God know what it is like to be a bat? Can he know what it is like to see the color red? So, to preserve God's omniscience, we might simply say, yeah, God does have this knowledge. He does have these truths. He knows what it feels like to be a bat. He knows what it feels like to see the color red. But the question then would be, well, how? How can God know what it is like to be a bat when he is not a bat? How can God know what it is like to see the color red when he doesn't have eyes or a body? Now, given that he knows everything else that there is to know, we could of course say that God can do a very good job of imagining what it is like to be a bat or imagining what it is like to see the color red, such that there is no important distinction between his imagination of these things and what these things actually feel like. But we still have that problem of ipseity, that there is a difference between imagining what it is like to be a bat and what it is actually like to be a bat. There is something particular to the experience of being a bat or being a human being that a divine agent simply will never understand. He is still a divine agent who is imagining what it is like to be a bat rather than actually being a bat himself. Or he is imagining what it is like to see the color red rather than experiencing the color red for itself. And another way to talk about this is the philosophical distinction between what we might call propositional knowledge, as we've already spoken about, and what we might call knowledge by acquaintance. So again, as human beings, we have a lot of sensory experiences, and each time we experience something sensorially in this way, we are learning something new. So if we eat an orange for the first time, then we are learning something new about oranges, about what they taste like, or at least what they taste like for us. But God, of course, has never eaten an orange. He doesn't have this knowledge by acquaintance. So it would seem to be the case then that human beings have a kind of knowledge, they have access to a kind of truth that is simply denied to God. And because God is imagined as this ultimate other, there doesn't seem to be any way to bridge that gap. God is never going to eat an orange, he is never going to see a red rose through human eyes. So it seems basically impossible to avoid this conclusion that there are aspects of knowledge and truth that are simply inaccessible to God. Now, there are certain philosophical or theological tools available to certain traditions to sidestep this problem somewhat. So this issue, I think, would not be a problem for believers in the Advaita Vedanta branch of Hinduism, which denies any distinction between Atman and Brahman, so our souls, basically, and the ground of all being are consubstantial, they are the same thing, and they would in fact go one step further and to say that there is no distinction to be made between Brahman and the entirety of creation, that everything is one, basically. And I think, yeah, in that case, the problem goes away, but Advaita Vedanta is not a theistic school, at least as I see it. It posits a god who is not really a creator god, who is separate from creation, but a kind of pantheistic or panentheistic god who doesn't really have any independent existence vis-a-vis everything else that exists. Everything is just collapsible to this single concept of Brahman. So if the theist is willing to take a similar step and to collapse this distinction between creator and creation, and some thinkers in Western history have done this, Spinoza most famously, But if you do this, then the problem kind of goes away. But of course, I don't think many theologians or philosophers working from within the Abrahamic tradition would be willing to take this step. I think that it's important in all these traditions that there really is a clear distinction to be made between God and the universe he is created. So while I think Hindus can sidestep this problem of omniscience, that option isn't really available to the monotheists in the Abrahamic traditions. But I can also imagine any Christians who are sitting there listening to this basically shouting into their screens right now, well, what about Jesus? So it's a very important aspect of Christian theology that God brought himself down to earth, that he was incarnated as a human being, and therefore that this is extremely theologically significant because it means that God actually does know what it is like to be a human being. So we can imagine all of the experiences that Jesus had on this planet. This would have included things like eating oranges, although I'm not sure if they had oranges in Judea at this time in history, but he certainly would have seen the color red. And so these arguments about the distinction between divine knowledge and human knowledge, the Christian might argue, simply disappear, because it is an important claim within the Christian tradition that Jesus emptied himself of his divinity in order to become fully human, and therefore God, in general, knows what it is like to be a human being. And to this, I would say that, firstly and most generally, I don't really think it does make the problem go away, because I think that there is a big difference between experiencing the world as an incarnated God and experiencing the world as a regular flesh and blood human being. But secondly, and most importantly, it still doesn't do away with the problem of ipseity, this problem that for each individual human being, not just for human beings in general, there is something about what it feels like to be us as opposed to any other person. So we could certainly grant that God knows what it is like to be a human being, but more specifically, we would have to say God knows what it feels like to be Jesus of Nazareth, but that does not necessarily mean that he knows what it feels like to be me, or what it feels like to be you. Or if we approach this from a sort of more philosophical angle, we can talk about the problem of indexical knowledge. So what we might be able to say, for example, is that God knows that James is now talking through a microphone to people all around the world. So we can say that God has this kind of third-person objective knowledge of what's happening, but he does not really know the preposition, which I know, that I am talking to you. So what is important here is the use of these indexical terms like I and you. Everybody who uses the words I and you are referring to different things by those terms. So when I say I know that I am talking to you, that is something that by definition God cannot know. He can know that James is talking to people. That would be a true proposition for God. But it is not true to say that God knows the proposition I am talking to you. So again, it seems pretty apparent to me that if theists cannot solve this problem of ipseity, of this clear distinction between ourselves and God, then there is at least going to have to be an admission that there are certain things that we can know, there are certain truths that we are in possession of which are not accessible to God. And that, of course, can be tricky enough in itself, but it has that deeper theological significance that it really does appear to undermine God's omniscience. And if God is not omniscient, then by what rights can we call him God? So this is not just a sort of how many angels can dance on the top of a pin type theological thought experiment. I think it really does have some very significant theological stakes attached here, because if we can't fix this problem of ipseity, then I think we basically have to do away with a notion of unqualified omniscience with respect to God. And, for various reasons, I think that that is theologically damaging. And certainly I think that many theistic philosophers of religion have recognized this as a problem, and so again there have been various ways of trying to avoid this problem. So one way to escape this issue would be to simply say that subjective experience, or ipseity in general, is not really a kind of knowledge, it's not really a kind of truth, so therefore God's omniscience is still vouchsafed. But I think that the thought experiments we went through earlier do show pretty strikingly that there is something about subjective experience which counts as a kind of knowledge in itself, even if it doesn't necessarily reach the levels of objective knowledge. Or the theistic philosopher might attempt to say that omniscience is not defined by including knowledge by acquaintance, so that when we talk about omniscience, all we are talking about is propositional knowledge and knowing every true proposition, so that God doesn't really need to know what it feels like to see the color red, or to eat an orange, or what it's like to be a bat, because this is just not part of the definition of what omniscience is. So I think this is a pretty cheap linguistic trick that doesn't really do away with the problem. So you can define omniscience however you want, but there is still this lingering problem that there is some aspect of the world, a very real, very important part of the world, that God does not have access to. So even if you want to argue that that does not threaten his omniscience, given this particular definition of omniscience, I think it does still point towards a lack in God's being, in God's experience of the world. And again, I think that remains a theological problem. But I think probably the most interesting approach I've come across as a way of tackling this problem is one that's been proposed by Linda Zagzebski, who argues for a position that she terms omnisubjectivity. So what omnisubjectivity suggests is that God actually really does experience the subjective states of every conscious being. So when a bat is flying through a cave using echolocation to find out where it is, God actually experiences that. He experiences that particular subjective experience in full. Or when Mary leaves her laboratory and sees a red rose, God has exactly that kind of experience as well. So if this theory works, it does away with the problem of ipseity and the problem of organisms having subjective knowledge that is inaccessible to God, but it throws up some pretty interesting problems as well. So again, there's this general problem of, if you want to bring God closer to creation, that is going to threaten God's aseity, it's going to threaten his kind of ontological independence. And in this case, perhaps the most striking objection to omnisubjectivity is what has been referred to as the problem of creepy thoughts. So what I want you to do is to imagine something really creepy, something that is just so horrible and disgusting and, generally creepy that you would be ashamed even to tell another human being that you are having this particular thought. So I'll give you a moment, be really creative here, come up with something really creepy. Now, keep that thought in your head for a moment. And now I want you to imagine that omnisubjectivity is true. God is having exactly that same creepy, horrible, disgusting thought that you are having currently. And I think that there is something genuinely comical about this idea that I can put a thought into my head And by doing that, I am forcing God to experience exactly what I am experiencing. So basically, I have the power to pollute God's mind with just absolute trash. And to me, I mean, maybe for a theist that's not really a problem. Maybe you could say, God's a big boy. He can handle these sorts of creepy thoughts. But to me, I think it does reduce the majesty of God a little bit to imagine that me, a simple, ordinary, fallible human being, can make God think the most disgusting, horrible things I can possibly imagine. And then, of course, there's less striking problems like if I stick a pin into my finger and experiencing pain, I am quite literally causing God to experience pain at that moment. And so, in collapsing this distinction between God and his creation, if you want to say that God really does experience creation in the same way that his creatures do, you're left with a God who I think is, well, certainly stripped of his aseity, certainly stripped of his ontological independence, but more than that, I think stripped of his majesty somewhat. I mean, I think it has to undermine the magic of God to suggest that we can wield this sort of immanent power over him, that we can make him experience whatever we want to make him to experience. And that is obviously going to pose some pretty tricky theological questions. So, on this point of view, we would have to imagine that God cannot be immutable because who God is, what God is experiencing, has to change along with human experiences. So, you have to sacrifice this property of immutability with respect to God. You have to sacrifice his aseity, as I've already said. And you basically have to concede that God is, to at least a certain degree, contingent on other beings, that the kinds of conscious experiences that I have or I choose to have are going to determine very directly, according to the theory of omnisubjectivity, what God is experiencing. So it has this sort of perverse effect of rather than making human beings contingent upon God, we are to an extent making God contingent upon human beings. And I think that's going to be a pretty big pill for a lot of theists to swallow. So, in summary, I don't think that there are any easy ways for theists to avoid this problem of ipseity, and what this means with respect to the theme of this episode. So, we're talking about whether God could be said to matter with respect to the issue of truth, and I think this problem of ipseity really does undermine that proposition. So, firstly, it seems to me apparent that we have to accept that there are certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of truth that derive from simply existing as a particular self. And so there are certain kinds of truths that are not dependent on the existence of God, at least not directly. So you could say, of course, that, God made these experiences possible because he created it, but the deeper problem is that from moment to moment, given our existence, we don't need the existence of God in order to secure certain truths. For example, what it feels like to experience the color red, what it feels like to eat an orange, what it feels like in general to be us in particular. So this becomes almost a kind of Cartesian argument. We can say that there is this Cartesian cogito, this source of self, this foundation of all experience, and that the kinds of truths that we glean from existing in this way are completely independent of the existence of God. God does not matter for the securing of these kinds of truths. And the next philosophical argument I'd like to look at here, which might be of relevance to this topic, was advanced by Alvin Plantinga, and it feels like I'm referencing Plantinga in basically every episode I do here. And that's because the guy has written about literally every topic that exists under the sun, so he's kind of hard to avoid. But Plantinga made what we might call an evolutionary debunking argument with respect to truth. So the argument runs something like this. If we are the product of natural selection, that there was no sort of divine intervention involved in the development of human beings, we would expect evolution to equip us only with those faculties that are strictly necessary for survival, and that these faculties are not necessarily going to be very reliable at tracking certain truths or identifying certain facts about reality. So I think that this is particularly obvious when we look at the case of animals. So I think Plantinga uses the example of a frog. So when a frog sees a sort of black shape buzzing around its head, it sticks out its tongue and attempts to eat this thing. So what evolution has equipped the frog with is a kind of faculty for detecting things in its environment that could be the source of food. But importantly for Plantinga, when a frog sticks out its tongue and eats a fly, it isn't really representing the truth of the situation. The frog doesn't necessarily have any understanding of what a fly is. It doesn't understand what it is trying to do. This is all very reflexive and intuitive behavior from the frog. So it's also something that is liable to be tricked. So if we start waving something black around the frog's head, the frog is going to try to eat it because its faculty is not designed to distinguish veridical from non-veridical things in its environment. It's not very good at distinguishing flies from things that just look like flies. And Plantinga would say that something similar should be applicable to human beings, that there is no particular reason for evolution to equip us with faculties for determining what is really true. All evolution should be doing is developing faculties that are good at just tracking certain specific features of the world that we need for survival. But Plantinga would go one step further here and say, it appears to be the case that human beings are actually pretty good at tracking the truth of things in the world. We, in contrast to the frog, have no problem distinguishing between a fake fly and a real fly. Or, probably more significantly, we have the ability to develop sophisticated theories of truths and theories about how the world works, so we can develop things like mathematics, which appear to track in a very deep and significant way certain truths about the world, but the point is that there really isn't a lot of evolutionary value in being able to do this. There's not really a huge threat to someone's survival if they fail to understand that 2 + 2 = 4. So Plantinga would therefore say, it's a bit of a mystery that human beings have this ability to track truth in the world relatively reliably. Evolution cannot be an explanation for this because evolution is a sort of satisficer with respect to the development of biological faculties. It's only going to develop those faculties that are just barely good enough to see an organism survive to the age where it is capable of reproducing itself. So Plantinga would therefore argue that the only way this can be explained, and indeed the only way that we can be sure that we have a reliable access to reality, that the kinds of things that we believe about the world are really true, is through the existence of God. Evolution is not in itself enough to secure this kind of foundation. So that's the argument, and the question, of course, we have to ask ourselves is, does it work? The first thing I'll say is that this is actually really quite a clever and ingenious argument, I think. And it's especially so because ordinarily these evolutionary debunking arguments are used against theistic claims. So evolutionary debunking arguments will tell us that we have been shaped by evolution, again, only to track certain truths in the world, that evolution is likely only to equip us with reliable truth-tracking faculties in those domains that are really important for survival. So, for example, it's very important for us to recognize that fire is hot, that it's going to cause us pain, because if we didn't know that, if we weren't capable of reliably tracking which parts of the world are on fire and which parts of the world are not, we probably wouldn't survive very long. We'd be constantly burning to death. But on the other hand, there is absolutely no reason to expect that evolution is going to provide us with faculties that can reliably track, let's say, metaphysical truths or moral truths. Firstly, because, these maybe are not truths that are accessible to biological organisms in the first place. But secondly, because they don't really confer a big survival advantage. So if we take a metaphysical debate, like the debate between universalists and nominalists with respect to the nature of the properties of things, there is absolutely nothing of consequence in this debate. So people will have different intuitions about what is true, but the evolutionary debunking argument would say that none of these intuitions can be trusted because there is just simply no way that evolution would have provided us with any sort of reliable way of tracking the difference between universal properties and nominalist properties. And so therefore, our intuitions, whichever side of this debate we fall on, are not to be trusted. But Plantinga has been able to sort of turn this type of thinking on its head and to say, actually, if we think about it, evolution shouldn't really be providing us with access to any sort of substantial truths at all. So therefore, what else could explain our ability to find out what is true? Well, it has to be God. Now, I've got two major criticisms of this argument, and the first one is I question really whether Plantinga's extreme skepticism about the kind of faculties that evolution is likely to develop is really justified. So as we've already talked about before, I think we actually would expect evolution to be pretty good at developing at least certain faculties in the mind of human beings or any other animals that are indeed reliable at tracking certain truths in the world. So as we said, it is very important for every animal to be able to recognize a fire, that a fire is hot, that it's potentially painful, because if an animal fails to recognize the truth of the situation in this context, it's going to get burnt to death, or it has to be able to recognize a high cliff, it has to be able to recognize, at least in a minimal sense, what counts as food, what is potentially food, and what is not. And that's going to be true for human beings. So what I would say is that actually we would expect evolution to be pretty good at developing faculties that are good at tracking truths on sort of human scales. We're going to be pretty good at recognizing fires and cliffs, food sources, water, trees, animals, other people, all these sorts of things. I think we can expect that our insights into reality are going to be pretty veridical because it's very important to our survival that our organism is reliably capable of tracking these sorts of truths. So I don't think there can be any doubt that evolution is going to be capable of generating true beliefs, at least in some context, but I think we can even broaden it. And so if we take something like geometry or arithmetic, someone like Plantinga would say that these are real truths, but we shouldn't expect evolution to be able to develop faculties to reliably track these truths because they don't really confer any sort of survival benefit. Being able to understand that 13 times 5 is 65 is going to be of absolutely no important benefit to any human being, or at least there is never a situation where a human being failing to understand that truth is going to die as a result of it. So Plantinga would say that these sorts of truths should not be accessible to human beings on evolutionary understandings. But I think what Plantinga fails to appreciate is the way that human cognition is structured. So what's particularly significant about human cognition is that the human being has a range of particular faculties, same as animals do, that are good at processing certain kinds of information. So at the most reductive level, we know that the brain has different components. The different parts of the brain do different things. This part of the brain is responsible for processing language. This part of the brain is responsible for processing visual information. This part of the brain is responsible for detecting predators, and so on and so forth. But what distinguishes the human being from animals in terms of cognition? Animals will have many of these same faculties, but human beings have a kind of generalized brain. And what human beings are able to do is to use faculties that were ostensibly developed to track one particular kind of truth in the world, but to use that faculty to uncover other sorts of truth in the world. This is something that's been referred to, I think, as the generalizability of cognitive domains in the human being. And we talked a little bit about this in my earlier episode on the cognitive science of religion. So in the cognitive science of religion, it's basically taken for granted that particular faculties of human cognition can be used in a kind of promiscuous way in a religious context in order to develop new, potentially valuable insights into the world. So the classic example in the cognitive science of religion is the generalizability of intuitions about agency. So as we said in that episode, human beings are pretty promiscuous in the attribution of agency. So we have this faculty that is ostensibly developed by evolution to, for example, track the beliefs and behaviors of other human beings, and I think it should be pretty clear why that sort of thing should be important for our survival. You know, we're social beings, we're not very good at surviving independently, we need to survive within a group, and survival within a group depends on being able to accurately represent the beliefs and behaviors of the other human beings that we live with. So this was a faculty that was probably developed, we can say, in order to solve this very narrow problem of survival, the problem of learning how to get along with other human beings. But once we have that faculty in place, and once we recognize that human cognition is very good at using particular faculties in a domain general way, there is nothing preventing us from using this faculty to understand truths from other domains. So, as I think I mentioned in that episode, if you want to explain to a child why it is that water molecules form, we can say something like, the hydrogen atoms want to stick to the oxygen atom. And by talking about these atoms as having a kind of agency, that hydrogen atoms want to do something, that hydrogen atoms have a particular goal, it's a lot easier for children, and probably adults as well, to understand how it is that molecular bonding works, that these atoms have, as I said, particular kinds of goals, particular kinds of patterns of behavior. That helps us to understand in a much more intuitive way how it is that molecular bonding works. But the point that Plantinga would have to appreciate here is that this kind of understanding was not directly selected for by natural selection. So it's not as though there was some evolutionary pressure to understand how it is that molecules bond, but rather there was an evolutionary pressure to develop this kind of faculty, this faculty which permits us to detect and to understand agency. But once we have that faculty in place, it can be used to glean a number of other kinds of truth without needing to develop any new specialized cognitive faculties. And the thinking is that a lot of the prodigious cognitive power of human beings stems not from the fact that we have extremely specialized brains, but rather that our brains are incredibly flexible vis-a-vis other animals, in terms of being able to reappropriate particular cognitive faculties in order to do novel processing and to understand particular features of the world that we otherwise wouldn't be able to understand. And so if we want to understand why it is that human beings have access to certain kinds of truth that don't seem to have any particular survival benefit to them, what we should in fact be looking for are the kinds of faculties, the kinds of parts of the brain that are being used to track these truths, and then to ask ourselves, what was it that these faculties were likely developed in response to? What were the selection pressures that led to the development of these particular faculties? And I think what we'll find in most cases is that there really isn't a big mystery. The kinds of faculties that we use to understand mathematics, for example, are going to be related to more general faculties like pattern recognition or spatial awareness, and these are things that I think definitely do confer some survival benefit. There are obviously going to be evolutionary advantages to any organism that has good pattern recognition, that has good spatial awareness. And the point is not that these faculties were developed specifically in order to solve mathematical problems. As Plantinga rightly points out, that is basically impossible to believe, but rather that we have these more generalized faculties that do confer an immediate survival benefit, but which can simply be reappropriated in cognition in order to track certain other kinds of truth that in themselves don't necessarily confer an immediate benefit to the survivability of the organism. So that's my kind of difficult and long-winded objection to Plantinga's theory, but there is a much simpler objection, I think, and one that is probably more fatal, and that is the problem of disagreement. So what Plantinga, I think, has to argue here is that God has somehow, during the process of evolution, infused us with reliable truth-seeking faculties, or he might say that the soul itself is a reliable tracker of truths, something like that. But he is going to argue that in one way or another, God is integral to the development of a human mind, which is really capable of reliably tracking truths in the world. But I'm not sure how this theory could possibly account for legitimate disagreements that people have about the nature of the world. Now, the mere existence of disagreements between people about what is true doesn't necessarily threaten any particular epistemic theory, because what we can say is, well, some people are just right and some people are just wrong. So the fact that we disagree about the shape of the Earth, so most people believe the Earth is round, there are a few people about the place who believe that the world is flat, this kind of disagreement shouldn't cause a great deal of anxiety or hand-wringing about, oh God, how can we possibly know the true shape of the Earth if this kind of disagreement exists? Rather, all we need to do is to say that some people are just mistaken, they have faulty approaches to thought, they have faulty approaches to the gathering of evidence, and so disagreement by itself doesn't necessarily have to spark any sort of dismay about our fundamental abilities to track truths in the world, because it could simply be the case that some people are right, some people are wrong. But if Plantinga is going to argue that God is somehow integral to our ability to track truths in the world, and that presumably we all have this same God-given faculty, whatever it might be, whether you want to call that a soul or some other kind of divinely inspired way of thinking about the world, but if all human beings have this faculty, then where does genuine disagreement come from? This is pretty easy to account on evolutionary explanations, because as we've said, as Plantinga himself said, we shouldn't expect evolution to give us perfect access to truth. All evolution has to do is to give us a view of the world that is true enough to ensure our survival. But if this is something granted by God, who is omniscient and omnipotent, what is happening in the minds of some people, what is going wrong, which causes them to disagree with other people. If one side of a debate always has to be wrong, then where does this wrongness come from on Plantinga's view of the world? So really on theistic assumptions, unless we want to assume that God is for some reason unfair and he gives some people really good truth-seeking faculties and other people much weaker truth-seeking faculties, then we should expect that there would be much more convergence amongst human beings about what is true than we currently find. So the most obvious example I could point to here is religious disagreement, where different traditions propound different truths, not just truths about the nature of what exists, what kind of gods or spirits or forces exist in the world, but moral truths as well. So even within the same traditions, there are often very deep, very vehement moral disagreements about what God wants us to do. And again, if we want to take the view that God is actively involved in the development of reliable truth-tracking faculties in the human being, then where does this disagreement actually come from? Shouldn't we more reliably be able to track the truth of particular religious claims? And surely wouldn't that lead to less religious disagreement? Now, there are various ways to explain this. So Plantinga himself has talked about the corrupting influence of sin, for example. So really everyone's truth-tracking faculties are in some sense equal. He particularly talks about this with respect to our God-tracking faculty, what he calls the sensus divinitatis. But he says that even though everyone's faculties are equal, it just happens to be the case that some people have their faculties clouded by sin. So the reason that the sensus divinitatis of Alvin Plantinga permits him to look out at the world and to see that it was created by God, that God really does exist, that is his faculty for tracking the truth of God working as intended, whereas I, an atheist, am just so clouded by sin that my sensus divinitatis fails to work as intended. Or, the faculties of people from other religious traditions, maybe they are not as riven with sin as I am, so they have a kind of partial truth about what God is like. But still, the Muslim conception of God or the Hindu conception of divinity, these are clouded by sin, so they're a little bit correct in assuming that there is a divine realm, but ultimately they are just too clouded by sin to make a reliable judgment about what God is actually like. Now, I don't think Plantinga has actually stated this sort of argument directly, but it is the logical consequence of what he's saying. It's basically, if you are Christian, if you believe the kinds of things that Plantinga does, congratulations, your sensus divinitatis is working as intended. But if you have beliefs which differ from this, if you believe in crazy things like polytheism or animism, or God help you, atheism, it's because you are just so riddled with sin to the core of your very soul that you cannot be trusted to make reliable judgments about reality at that fundamental level. Now, as I said, I don't think that Plantinga made that argument directly, although he has, by the way, directly stated that sin is one reason for the existence of religious disagreement in particular, but I think it can be generalized to say that the reason that different human beings have different truths, even though they have supposedly been infused by God with equally well-functioning faculties for reliably detecting truth in the world. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time attacking this point of view. I think most people should be able to intuitively recognize where it's going wrong. I mean, firstly, of course, there's the issue that God should have anticipated the arrival of sin in the world, so why would he give us these faculties which are so easily corrupted by sin? And more than that, I think it's, again, a kind of odious argument, and a lot of these arguments that appear in the Anglophone philosophy of religion seem to take it that something like Christianity, or at least monotheism, is the kind of default theistic expectation, and that anyone who deviates from these sorts of beliefs is somehow defective. It's very, very difficult to avoid reading arguments like this in this way. There really is a kind of egoism which says, my understanding of God is reliable because my sensus divinitatis is working perfectly, but everyone else is just too steeped in sin to recognize how things really are. I mean, what can you really say to someone who believes that they are so special in that respect? But I think that there have been better and more charitable ways of interpreting the religious differences between human beings, and therefore explaining this problem we've just touched on of how it is, given the existence of God, there are such deep and seemingly irreconcilable differences between the kinds of understandings that different people have about what God is like, or indeed whether God exists at all. And so I think that all religious traditions have had to face this issue at some point during their histories. So this idea that if we are in possession of the truth, why are there all these other people running around who are claiming their own truths? Why don't they see the truth as we do? What explains this religious difference? And I think it's probably Hinduism and Buddhism that have the easiest time dealing with this. So both of them posit this concept of avidya, this notion that human beings are somehow fundamentally ignorant of their situation, and that it takes not necessarily achieving enlightenment, but certainly a rigorous religious program of learning how to see the world properly before you can come to acknowledge the truth. So in these traditions, there's a very easy explanation for why many other cultures believe different things, and that is simply that they are ignorant. They just haven't properly learnt to see the world for what it actually is. And in Hinduism, there's also this long-standing doctrine of nama rupa, which translates as name and form. And what it amounts to is this idea that there is one fundamental reality, typically described as Brahman, but that Brahman can reveal itself to the world, manifest in the world, in a variety of different forms, and accordingly it can be given different names. So the Hindu tradition is very comfortable with the idea that there are different gods who appear in different ways, but that these are ultimately just surface-level distinctions, that every god that exists is really just a manifestation of this fundamental Brahman appearing to people under different names and different forms. So the Hindu could easily say that different gods that are worshipped in different traditions or any other sort of religious concept can be explained in this way. So the Hindu doesn't need to deny, for example, the divinity of Jesus Christ or the reality of any other sort of religious concept from a different tradition. They could simply say that, yeah, this is how Brahman appeared to these people, and that explains why they worship things we don't. It's just that the way that Brahman was made manifest to them is different to the way it was made manifest to us. And thus, there is not necessarily anything to explain here. Religious difference is, in fact, exactly what we should expect to see on a Hindu view of the world. But I think that the problem of religious difference is a bigger problem for the Abrahamic faiths, because they, of course, posit a big God who is the sole divine force in the universe, who is pronouncing particular commandments that he expects people to follow, and who, in one way or another, is demanding a great degree of fealty from human beings. And under these sort of systems, there shouldn't really be alternative ways of living, alternative ways of worshipping, because there is a single God with a single set of commandments and expectations for human beings. So within Islam, there has been this doctrine developed of fitra, which is this idea that in fact all human beings are born worshipping Allah, or at least understanding that there is just a single God in existence. And that, unfortunately, for one reason or another, whether it's because of ignorance or they're being led astray or just the gradual corruption of the monotheistic tradition, different people have come to believe different things. They have started to worship multiple gods. This is the crime of shirk in the Quranic rhetoric. And even in the Quran, there is this sort of discursive subtext which seems to be making the claim that the people who engage in shirk, the people who associate other gods with Allah, actually in some sense know the truth. So there are rhetorical flourishes in the Quran which say things like, they know that Allah created the stars and the suns, and yet they continue to associate other gods with him. So the rhetoric is that if people believe in different things to what we believe, the reason is because they have somehow been corrupted. But there is still a deep part of themselves which recognizes the truth of monotheism, the truth of Islam, I suppose. And it's just through their intransigence or their being led astray or, as we said, their ignorance, which causes them to fall short of the purely monotheistic ideals of the nascent Islamic faith. In Judaism too, there is obviously in the Hebrew Bible a pretty clear awareness of people falling away from the faith, so there are long narratives about the Hebrew people failing to live up to their covenant with Yahweh, and the Hebrew people, falling away, worshipping golden calves, things like this. But strangely, as far as I can tell, within the narratives, there doesn't seem to be any attempt to explain this happening. The explanation just appears to be that they are somehow being naughty, that they know that what they are doing is wrong, but like incorrigible children, they do it anyway. So Judaism certainly is aware of the problem of religious difference. It doesn't like people following alternative traditions. Of course, that's probably the key message of the Hebrew Bible. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to have concerned itself with why this should be the case, with why religious differences should exist in the first place, or why people might be attracted to these sorts of practices. But I would say that the problem of religious difference is probably most acute in Christianity, and that's because Christianity doesn't just posit God as the ultimate truth, but also as a distinctly personal being who is apparently seeking a loving relationship with us. And if that is the case, if God is the ultimate truth, and he wants to be personally connected somehow with human beings, we have this problem as to how it is that he allows 75% of the world's population at the moment to be non-Christian, to believe in very different things to what Christians believe, and therefore to, in some sense, be alienated from God, from the Trinitarian God, at least. Now, admittedly, historically, Christians haven't much exercised themselves about this problem, so they have these categories of heathen, pagan, heretic, and so on. So the thinking for much of Christian history has certainly been that if people fail to see the truth of Christianity, then it's their own fault. It's just they have been seduced by evil forces, or they are somehow wallowing in ignorance, or they have not yet had the blinding light of Christian civilization arrive to them just yet. So there's very much been this rhetoric in the history of Christianity, of course, that Christianity is self-evidently superior to all other forms of religious belief, and if anybody fails to see that, then it's their own fault, and we should pity them more than anything else. But of course, in today's world, that sort of rhetoric doesn't fly. We have to share a world together. Christianity has to learn how to get along with other faiths. But then this problem reasserts itself. So if God is the ultimate truth, and he seeks a personal relationship with us, and one of the methods by which he has pursued that relationship with us is by incarnating himself as Jesus Christ and sacrificing himself on the cross for the sins of humanity, then why is it that so many people have not been permitted access to that truth? How is it that God permits so many people to be alienated from him by believing in religious doctrines that are ostensibly untrue? So particularly over the last 100 years or so, a lot of Christian philosophers and theologians have felt the need to address this issue of religious pluralism and to try to develop a way to account for this situation, for the reality of religious difference, given that the Christians themselves, of course, assert that they are in possession of an ultimate truth. And we don't have the time here to go into all of the different ways that Christians have attempted to account for religious pluralism throughout history. So we'll focus here on just one particular idea, and that is John Hick's conception of the real, as he puts it. That's real with a capital R. And his theory has been very much influenced by Kantian philosophy, and again, I don't think we want to go very deep into what Kantian philosophy involves, but the important aspect to focus on here is that Immanuel Kant made a distinction between what he called phenomena and noumena, and the idea is that there is something that exists, there is an independent reality, what Kant called noumena, but in a way this is inaccessible to human beings. So our experience of the world is structured by what he calls pure concepts of the understanding. So when we look at the world, we're not simply passively imbibing what is there, but rather through mental operations, through these pure concepts of the understanding, we are lending structure to our sensory experience. So we conceptualize what we see in terms of time and space and other categories like this that impose what we might say is a kind of false order on the sensory data in order to make that sense data useful and appreciable to us, but that what we experience this way as phenomena is different from what the noumena is, what the thing in itself is. And so in this way, there will always inevitably be a kind of difference between the way that we experience the world and how the world actually is. So Hick's insight here is that we can basically use this framework to explain manifest religious differences. So basically we have a noumenal realm that is a kind of independent reality. This is what Hick calls the real, big R real. But inevitably, human beings are not going to have access to that real. All they are going to have access to are phenomenological impressions, which are in some sense dictated by the concepts we have or our cultural prejudices, things like that. And so inevitably our phenomenological experiences of the noumenological realm are going to be different. So when a Hindu encounters the real, when a Christian encounters the real, they are, in a sense, encountering the same thing. Numerologically, they are experiencing the same thing, but phenomenologically, their experience of the real is going to be different. Now, actually, there is a great deal of merit to this, and if you go back to one of my earlier episodes where I discuss the nature of religious concepts, I actually begin that episode by talking about the nature of concepts in general, and although I don't count myself as a Kantian, there is definitely some truth in this idea that our experience of the world is filtered through concepts, that the concepts we already have are going to structure our experience and therefore structure what we see in the world, what we believe about the world, and so on. And so therefore, even if we presume that there is some sort of ultimate reality that we can call the real or God or the thing in itself or what have you, that we are never going to have unfiltered access to this reality. We are all going to put a kind of different phenomenological gloss on what we see, and therefore we're going to come away with different understandings and interpretations of the world. So up until this point, I would say that I actually agree with John Hick. I think he really has captured something important about the way human beings think about the world and how they develop different religious ideas or ideas in general. But where we would differ is, I guess, in our interpretations of these facts. So I think that the first problem that Hick is going to face here is that in positing this big distinction between reality, the object of all religious desires, and our experience of that object, he's essentially telling believers that they are never actually going to properly apprehend what is really true, what is really real. And as an atheist, again, I have no problem accepting that point of view, that, yeah, to an extent, everything that we experience is merely phenomenal in nature. We don't really have access to this noumenal realm. But I don't think that there are going to be many believers who would accept this claim from Hick. They would see things very differently. So try telling the average Christian, for example, or the average Muslim, well, actually, you are not in possession of the truth. All you have is a mere phenomenological gloss over nature. That's all you really have access to. You do not really have access to this independent, ultimate truth like you claim. Well, they're not going to like that. They're not going to accept that conclusion. And the reason is that it basically undermines every special claim that a religion is making. So if you want to say that all religious beliefs are purely phenomenal in nature and that they don't really have direct access to this noumenal realm, then what you're sort of saying is that every religious tradition is kind of epistemically fungible. And by that I mean it doesn't really matter which tradition you subscribe to. Every religious tradition, in a way, has its own perfectly valid interpretation of what is true, but there is no real particular reason to privilege the truth, let's say, of one tradition over another, because, as we've said, they are all just kind of conceptual, perceptual interpretations of the world. They are not actually describing the real unsick, as Hick puts it, the real thing in itself. But if that's the case, then whether I choose to call myself a Christian or a Muslim is a matter of pure indifference. Both of us are kind of partly correctly describing reality in the, particular idioms of our cultural contexts or something like that. But otherwise, there is no particular reason to say, for example, that Christianity is true in a special way that Islam is not, or vice versa. Whether I choose to be a Christian, whether I choose to be a Muslim, these are equally valid paths to pursuing the real. But why would I privilege one over the other if their truth content is equal? and neither can claim any sort of especial insight into what this real unsick is really like. And the second related problem with this kind of thinking is that, as Hick himself would have to concede, the real itself is somehow fundamentally, in principle, inaccessible to us. We are never really going to know if our phenomenal experience of the real could in any way said to be legitimate or valid or not, because we can't have independent access to this real thing, so there is no way that we can compare our phenomenal experience of the real to how the real actually is. And what this does is that if we are going to posit God or the real or whatever you want to call it as the kind of ultimate truth, then firstly, it means that we are never actually going to access what the ultimate truth is, and I think that's a theological problem all in itself. But the other aspect of this is that it basically renders the existence of God, or whatever other name you want to call this ultimate reality, a matter of complete indifference. On this sort of conceptual scheme, it literally makes no difference whether or not God exists. It doesn't matter what ultimate reality is actually like. What matters is our phenomenal experience of the world. That is the only thing we really have access to. But if that is the case, then it doesn't really matter what the noumenal world is actually like. If I believe that ultimate reality is filled with this omnipotent, omniscient, greatly magisterial being, and this grants me certain ways of living in the world, it grants me certain understandings or consolations that really help me in my life, it makes absolutely no difference whether or not it could be said that this sort of phenomenal experience actually corresponds to reality at its most fundamental level. My experience of the world is going to be exactly the same whether or not we could claim that those phenomenal experiences are veridical or not. So again, it collapses the existence of God, and certainly the role of God as ultimate truth maker in the universe, as a matter of complete indifference. On this point of view, it really, really doesn't matter whether or not God really exists. And the third problem here is that even though this is an explanation that has, I think, been offered for very good reasons, I think Hick really was trying to forge a path that would permit a kind of religious pluralism in the world, and that would allow the different religious traditions to kind of come together and to say, well, yeah, we have all of these manifest differences, but actually we are all pursuing the same thing, just in different ways. So there is a very good intention here. I think Hick really does want to ameliorate the potential difficulties that having different religious traditions with different religious beliefs can bring to the world, and, the kinds of conflicts that can result from that. But the difficulty is that Hick doesn't really give us any way to resolve these differences. In fact, he's telling us that, in principle, there is no way to resolve religious disagreements, because there is absolutely no grounds on which any particular religious tradition could claim to have access to some kind of truth, or at least some kind of religious truth, that is true independently of their own phenomenal experience. So if a Christian says, for example, that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, and a Jewish person says, no, he is not, on ordinary ways of approaching truth, this debate is, at least in principle, resolvable. So the Christian can provide certain evidence, let's say, for their claim. They can attempt to justify, using facts and logic, why it is they believe that the claim that Jesus Christ is the Messiah is justified, and the Jewish person, of course, will have their own reasons for disagreeing with this. But on ordinary approaches to religious truth, these are debates that can really happen, and there might even, in principle, be a way of deciding that one particular side of this debate is correct and that the other is wrong. And I know that it never works out this way in practice, but that would at least be a path to religious dialogue and the evolution of different religious traditions. They could genuinely learn something from each other to the extent they believe that different religious traditions might really have access to particular truths about the world. But if all religious claims are merely informed by phenomenal experience rather than experience of what is really true, then I don't actually know what kind of dialogue can go on here, what kind of debate there could be, or what kind of process religious traditions themselves might be able to employ to get closer to the truth, to develop a system of thought that is somehow more true, because we're basically denying the possibility of accessing the truth in question. And I think that the best way to illustrate the issue in question here is to invoke an analogy that I think is found somewhere in the Hindu scriptures, and it's an analogy which describes four blind men trying to describe their experience with an elephant. So the first blind man grabs the leg of an elephant, and he says, "Oh, this thing must be a pillar. It must be a great building that I'm holding on to." The second blind man grabs the elephant's tail and says, "No, this is a rope." The third man touches the elephant's tusk and says, "No, this is a spear," and so on and so on. And so the point of this analogy in Hindu thought is to show that, yeah, there is something real, there really is an elephant, but depending on how you approach the elephant, you're going to get different views on what the elephant is like. So by analogy, we are really sort of all blind men who are groping in the dark, attempting to describe reality. We are all able to accurately pick out certain features of reality. So in this analogy, the elephant's tail is really there, the elephant's legs are really there, the elephant's tusks are really there. So when the blind men are reporting their experiences, they are all describing something that is, let's say, objectively true, but their failing, of course, is that they misrepresent their own particular experiences as the complete truth. And on Hinduism, this is a very nice analogy, and it comports with this Hindu notion of nama rupa that we already discussed, that the fundamental reality of the universe can appear to people in different ways, and so different ways of discussing divinity or what is ultimately real can all be valid, even though they might be missing the bigger picture, that there is something beyond the world of phenomenal experience, that there really is this big elephant, but they're just all too blind to see it for what it is. Now, I also happen to think that this is a very nice analogy, though, of course, for very different reasons than the original authors might have favored it. So what I'd say here is that an important lesson we should draw from this story is not simply that the blind men were experiencing different things, or that their phenomenal experience of reality was different because they were approaching reality from different angles. But what I'd point out here is that all of them were wrong. I mean, objectively wrong. If you believe that an elephant is a rope, you are wrong. If you believe that an elephant is a pillar, you are wrong. And I would go one step further and say not merely that these blind men were wrong, but they were dangerously wrong. I mean, if you approach an elephant with the understanding that the elephant is a rope, you are going to get trampled to death. So here, the blind men are not simply wrong, but they are dangerously maladapted to the world in which they live. And I think we can even extend this lesson one step further and to recognize that each of them were wrong, but they also persisted in their particular belief that they were right. And if they had wanted a more complete and more accurate picture of what the elephant is really like, what they would need to engage in is open dialogue, a discussion of the facts, and a willingness to come together and achieve a kind of intersubjective consensus about what they had experienced. So if they all came to the table and said, yeah, I felt this rope-like thing, I felt this pillar-like thing, I felt this spear-like thing, they could have used those experiences and pulled them together to get a much more accurate picture of what an elephant is like. But in the original narrative, they don't do this. They persist in their delusions that an elephant is like a rope, that an elephant is like a pillar, and so on. And to me, this really is a perfect analogy for religious conflict. This is exactly what is going on in the world, where religious people really do believe that they are in possession of some special truth. There is no possibility here for compromise or dialogue, and that is at the root of a lot of religious conflict in the world. But what we should instead be aspiring to is what Charles Taylor beautifully described. This is one of my favorite two-word phrases in the history of philosophy. What we should be aspiring to is intersubjective univocity. And Charles Taylor used this phrase to describe what the scientific quest is. So he would say that in a sense, we are all sort of imprisoned by our subjectivity. It's going to be very difficult for any single one human being to have a good grasp of what is objectively true. But if we pull together our different experiences and test these using the most objective criteria we possibly can, which we can all agree will lead us closer to the truth, then we can reach this kind of intersubjective univocity that we haven't necessarily caught on to what is objectively true, but we have at least arrived at a way of achieving a kind of intersubjective consensus. So in this way, by agreeing on certain particular epistemic standards and agreements on what would count as good evidence for something, we can, in a way, transcend our subjectivity. We can break out of the prison which is our own mind and really get a better grasp of what is objectively true. And when it's functioning properly, this is what the scientific method certainly should be aspiring to, but I think can also, in principle, achieve. But if we are going to insist on the propriety of our subjective experiences and fail to sort of come up with a system by which our subjective experiences can be pooled and tested and improved, then we're just going to sort of be running in an epistemic hamster wheel where we're not going to get anywhere. And this is the problem that the blind men in the analogy face. If they came together and agreed on particular standards by which the elephant could most properly be investigated and how their different findings could be pooled and explained in a bigger theory, then they could have actually arrived at the truth. But to the extent that they were committed to the truth of their own individual subjective experiences, they're going to get nowhere. One of them's going to say the elephant's a rope, the other is going to say it's a pillar or a spear, and they are going to get nowhere. And again, I think that's a pretty perfect analogy for how religious thought works in practice. And Hick's argument here, I think, is going to face the same objection that it doesn't leave us with any way to arbitrate between disagreements. It's basically saying that we cannot aspire to anything other than our own subjective interpretations of the world. And, I mean, firstly, I don't think that's particularly helpful for resolving debates or conflicts. But more importantly, it amounts to a kind of nihilistic attitude towards truth, that we are never going to have access to what is true. Indeed, we probably shouldn't even bother debating this because we're not going to get anywhere. We can't really get outside of our own heads to investigate what reality is like. And to me, as I said, that's quite a nihilistic attitude towards truth. And in the context of this episode, it also renders God or the real as completely irrelevant to how it is that we construct truths, and therefore, again, we would have to reach the conclusion that on Hick's approach to this topic, God does not matter with respect to the establishment of truth. And so I think that's finally all I have to say on this topic. So to reiterate what I've already discussed throughout this episode, I don't believe that there is any necessary connection between God and the foundations of truth. I don't believe that God is particularly good when it comes to revealing what is true. I think it can be established that certain truths exist independently of God. God is somehow inaccessible anyway, so we can't really draw any firm truths from the mere existence of God. And so therefore I would draw the conclusion, and you probably could have anticipated this from the beginning of the episode, that when it comes to truth in general, the existence of God does not really matter. So once again, I'll thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed. See you again next time. Bye bye.